You know, I wanted to start out with just a brief 2-minute clip here. And let me preface this. This is kind of the lighthearted part to some degree, since I want to do something to tie in with the NBA Finals, since we have the Warriors-Cavs game today. And one of the commentators who is in town to discuss some of the NBA Finals is Isaiah Thomas, who is the older Isaiah Thomas. There's a younger Isaiah Thomas as well. And Isaiah Thomas is a basketball Hall of Famer. He's also been an NBA coach as well as a college coach as well. And this is a clip that actually a colleague showed me, and I wanted to start with this because what we're going to have is a kind of discussion about race as a social construct. And the backdrop for this is that Isaiah Thomas was giving this panel on with Shaquille O'Neal, some others, and it was about Black History Month. So I'm just going to run this really brief segment of this. Thanks, Fong.
Because he makes a statement that it's a racist country, right? And in order for this to be a racist country, you have to believe in the social construct of race. Race is not a biological construct. I mean, it's not biological, it's social and cultural. And Greg Popovich and Red Auerbach, as men, did not buy into the construct of race. They looked at all of us as human beings. And when we deal from a human standpoint, not from a racial standpoint, but just from a human standpoint, then we are all equal. There's no black, there's no white. Race is a social construct. It's not biological. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's an historian, race is a social construct, right? Michael Omi, Howard Winnett, UC Berkeley, who wrote the book Racial Formation in the USA, said race is a social construct. And for those who choose not to opt into the construct of the social norms of America that we live in, right? If you choose not to participate in the construct, then you have the choice to view and treat each other as human beings. And that's what Red and Pop are talking about, and that's what they're doing. They're looking at all of us as human beings, not through the lens of race. And you have a choice, because again, it is a construct in America. It's not biological.
And Barrett is blessed.
Oh, you can stop right there. Thank you. I had to show you that because that's probably the first and last time I ever get a shout out from an NBA Hall of Fame basketball player. And in fact, Isaiah Thomas starts this discussion. What I want to do this afternoon is really to talk to you about our systems of racial classification that we employ and the political consequences of them. And the very act of sort of defining racial groups is a process which is really fraught with a lot of confusion, a lot of contradiction, and a lot of unintended consequences as well. And it's important for us to realize that government definitions of race have varied widely across time and space. And there was a time in America, for instance, when it was possible to change one's race simply by crossing state lines. Persons, for example, were defined as black if they were 1/16th African descent in Kentucky, of 1/8 African descent in Florida, Indiana, Nebraska, North Dakota, among other states, and 1/4 African descent in Oregon. So we had this peculiar situation where there was a time where individuals could be black in one state and, in fact, white in another, and change race by crossing state lines. Along with these state-based definitions, we have historical shifts in scientific knowledge in fields ranging from physical anthropology to the genomic sciences that fuel debates about what race may or may not mean as an indicator of human variation. And the approach I'm taking here is this notion of racial formation. And essentially, racial formation is this has this emphasis on the social construction of race, and is really about the socio-historical process, if you will, of how races are made, race making, and their impact throughout the social order. And race making is fundamentally a process of othering, defining and categorizing people as other. And I should say, of course, that defining groups, people as other is obviously not restricted to distinctions based on race. We have gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, even age, among other perceived differences, are frequently evoked to justify structures of inequality, to lead to differential treatment, subordinate status, and, in some cases, violent war and conflict. And classifying people by different perceived attributes is really a universal phenomena. And as social beings, we kind of utilize social categories in order to navigate our world and discern who may be friend or foe and provide clues to guide our interactions with the people we meet and the groups we encounter. But as I said, and I want to emphasize again, that this act of defining racial groups is really this process that's fraught with a lot of confusion and contradiction and unintended consequences. Now, this is particularly true, and let me start with state-based definitions of race. State-based racial classifications are never stable and are subject to challenges by individuals and groups who contest existing identities, make claims for the recognition of new identities, and argue for ways to achieve much more alignment between the ways individuals and groups see themselves and the ways in which state agencies may classify them. And my interest in state definitions of race was really inspired by this court case that was in the 1980s. And this was the case of Susie Phipps in the state of Louisiana. It's a kind of really interesting case, if you will. Case really arose during the late 1970s when Ms. Phipps, who was in her 40s, was going to leave the country for the first time. And she needed a passport. She never in her life had a passport. So what do you require for a passport? You require a birth certificate. So she goes to the Louisiana Bureau of Vital Records, and quite to her surprise, she gets reissued a birth certificate which describes her race as black, even though Miss Phipps has always thought of herself as being white. And what happened in the subsequent court case, too, was that she fell into this category. In 1970, the state of Louisiana passed a law that said anybody with more than 1/32 black blood had to be legally classified as black in the state of Louisiana. And according to the state's genealogical investigation, Miss Phipps was 3/32 black. I'm not quite sure how they got that. But it involved going over these records of her family, which reside in the Lake Charles region in Louisiana, and to make this thing. This case actually goes all the way to the Louisiana State Supreme Court, which rules in favor of the state being able to define how they want to classify, racially classify people. It then goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refuses to hear it, thereby letting the Louisiana State Court ruling remain in effect. Later, we could talk about this later. Later, Louisiana had to change that into a system of self-reported race. But at the time, in the 1980s, that was the law. All right? Now, this gets at this social construction of race, or the political construction of race, in that this category, more than 1/132nd, has been utilized in the state of Louisiana to define who is a black example. And really the determination of racial categories and racial identity has been no simple task. And over the past several centuries in this country, it's provided numerous debates about natural and legal rights, about who could become a citizen of the United States, and indeed who could marry whom. The examples would be that it wasn't until 1952, through the McCarran-Walter Act, the General Immigration and Security Act, that the United States finally recognized that race couldn't be used as a reason to deny a person from becoming a naturalized citizen of the United States. And that certainly affected, at that point in time, mainly Asians, People like Japanese Americans, such as my grandparents, could not become naturalized citizens of the United States till after 1952. And most of you are familiar with the 1967 Loving versus State of Virginia decision, which declared that the anti-miscegenation laws, the laws in many states that prohibited the issuance of a marriage license between a white person and a non-white person, were unconstitutional. 1967 isn't that long ago. What might be even more scarier for you to note is that Alabama had their interracial marriage ban on the books, if not enforceable, and it was not repealed until the year 2000. I'm sure that's kind of in many of your lifetimes. I should say, and as a side, in a statewide vote in Louisiana, 41% of the voters wanted to maintain the interracial ban. So in fact, it did not pass with overwhelming support in the state of Louisiana. Now, where a lot of these state definitions can be clearly seen is through the census. And racial and ethnic categories in the United States have historically been shaped by the political and social agendas of particular times. And what you might be curious to note is that there's almost been no two censuses in which the racial and ethnic categories, or the questions we ask, have been the same. This, and it's hard to see, I know, okay, is the racial terms used in the census throughout the 20th century. And it might be surprising to note that there's only been 3 consistent racial labels, and those were white, Chinese, and Japanese. With Chinese and Japanese being coded as separate racial groups. And in fact, the term black has gone through Negro, black, different historical changes with respect to that. There's some curious ones here. The use of the term Mexican as a race was only used once in 1930 and subsequently rescinded due to pressure from the Mexican government as well. It's a longer story, but after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, Mexican citizens were allowed to become citizens of the United States, should they elect to. And in fact, before that time, Mexicans were quoted as, were counted as white. And in fact, after 1930, they would go through that designation as being white again. There's other curious ones here. There was, in fact, a mixed race category. You could see mulatto being used earlier in the 20th century. This one's curious as well. Hindu in 1930 and 1940. It was meant to capture the number of South Asians, particularly Asian Indians in the United States. Hindu is a religious designation, however. And what's even more curious is that the overwhelming bulk of Asian Indians in the United States in that time were Sikh, and then second Muslim, and then third Hindu. But nonetheless, it became a kind of racialized category here as being Hindu. But the point of this is, as you can see, is that going from very few categories, you see real expansion of categories after 1970, particularly after 1980 and 1990, which is a reflection of changing demographics in this country, but also changing recognition of how we think about racial and ethnic categories. Well, this is the next thing I want to show you is the thing that you may be most familiar with. These are what we still labor under. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget's Statistical Directive 15. And these are the official sort of federal categories and definitions of race. It was initially initiated in 1977 in response to the fact that different federal agencies were using different kinds of racial and ethnic labels and coding. So they wanted to have a consistent basis upon which this was being done. But the impact of this was to really influence our overall understanding of race and ethnicity in the United States. In many respects, these categories are sort of like the basic food groups of American multiculturalism as they became adopted and utilized. And it was changed around again in 1997. There's a couple of things that happened in 1997. I should come back to that later. So what you have now is these definitions of who a person is, an American Indian, Alaska Native, an Asian, Black or African American. What got separated out in 1997 was the distinction between Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, which was originally part of the Asian group, and for interesting kind of political reasons, was separated out into two different categories. Note too the lack of parallel construction here. We have blacks being defined as a person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa, leading of course to what are the black racial groups of Africa. But whites aren't defined as a person of the white racial groups, but a person of the original peoples of Europe, Middle East, or North Africa. The other thing which you should observe is that being a person who's Latinx or Hispanic is really not a racial category at all. It's an ethnic one, and it's the only one the feds are interested in. Are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? With the understanding then that that is separated out from the question of race. All right? Have any questions too, just flag me. And I'm going to show you, oh yes.
Okay, so about the last slide.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, like, if you could share a little bit about why, like, or how that, because I noticed that there were some that like show up one year and then just like disappear.
Right.
And I was just wondering, like,
That was a concerted effort. You know, I told you about the failed 1930 racialized category of Mexican. So it came up again in the wake of the civil rights movement as well, where a lot of Latinx political leaders, some, wanted to record data. We didn't know what was going on with respect to that population. And so they led to the creation and the acknowledgement by the Office of Management Budget of a Hispanic category. But even here, the definition you see is a cultural one. And it's one almost based on imperial culture, because it says Spanish culture or origin, leading peoples of Portuguese, under Portuguese political regimes, colonial regimes like Brazil, a little bit with absence on that. So that's how it came to fruition.
so it's more community organizing that?
It was from the bottom up, but of certain political elites being able to make those claims from the bottom up.
Whereas these groupings are top down, where it's like federals trying to standardize.
Yes, although I don't want to get into it too much now, but the Native Hawaiian one was the result of Native Hawaiians initially wanting to move it into the Alaska Native American Indian category, indigenous category, and the Office of Management Budget didn't allow that, but it did allow a split between Asians and Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. We can talk about that later. I'll go into that as well. Now, next we have, which you may or may not be familiar with, these were the questions that were asked in the 2010 census. I don't know if any of you filled out the 2010 census. There are two questions. One is on ethnicity. The other is on race. So it asks you first, is this person one, or are you, of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? There's basic subgroups, 3 subgroups here, Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban. And then you could fill in a blank. And then there's a question regarding race, in which you can fill in being an American Indian or Alaska Native. And also you have Asian and Pacific Islander categories. And finally, a question asking some other race. Now, what's interesting about this is that there was tremendous amounts of confusion, particularly among the Latinx population in regard to this. And between I think it's 1980, could be, at least 1980, 1990, census 2000, census 2010, that's right, that's 4 censuses, that it's argued that about 40% of people who are of quote unquote Hispanic origin fill out the census wrong. And by wrong is they're supposed to check off ethnicity one and a race one. An example of that, you're a very dark-skinned Puerto Rican. You should check off on the first one that you're Puerto Rican, come down to question around race and say you're black. You're a very light-skinned or European Argentinian. Quote that you're Argentinian, come down and you mark off that you're white. In fact, what people did was to ignore both those things and come down here and write something under some other race and write in that they were Puerto Rican or Brazilian or something, or Argentinian or something like this. So one of the things the census has been trying to grapple with is trying to capture that, the ambiguities involved in that. So what I'm going to show you next is what I thought was, until a couple of months ago, what I thought was going to be the 2020 questions. And I was totally wrong on this, and I'll tell you about that.
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Sure.
When they were coming up, when OMB was coming up with Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin
Yes.
question, what exactly were they trying to capture? Just like who has been touched by Spain, or like?
You know, there's actually, it's a long, complicated story. There's a woman who teaches sociology here, Cristina Mora, who has written about this very thing, about how this category came into existence. I'm going to sort of shove that under there to say that there were different motives involved, and there were different choices that had to be made in the construction of that category, in the recognition of the category. But I'm going to show you something which became the next flashpoint of debate, and maybe that'll help you out here. So what am I saying? Well, the census is always doing, a while back I got to spend about 4 days or something with the census, and both give talks and get talked to about what they do. And people in the census are they really do a lot of their homework with respect to theories of race and ethnicity, and they're very well grounded. Many of them are, of course, academics. And they've been doing these kinds of research and planning for the 2020 census, responding to now changing demographics, but the increase in complexity of immigrants coming into the United States. Also, the ways in which racial and ethnic identity is not static, but is extremely fluid. And also widespread campaigns and lobbying for changes in the questions and categories. I'll give you an example of this. In Census 2020, there's a big campaign among Iranians to get debates to see how many Iranians. So they said, don't check off your white. Come down here and write some of the race and write Iranian. And so we do have some data with respect to that because of that kind of campaigning and lobbying around that. So they released this thing last year in which they talked about the results of the census released this. And I'm going to show you what I thought was going to be our 2020 census. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I should just mention this. This is just something which shows you that 2/3 of Hispanic adults saying that being quote unquote Hispanic is part of their racial background. So you see that some say it's a racial background, some say it's an ethnic background, but 67% said it's kind of both. It's kind of wedded into one category. And this next thing will be sort of reflective of that. So I'm sorry this thing is so, I don't know, kind of like not very clear, huh? I guess that's the clearest we can get on the projector. This was what was called the optimal elements from this national content test, which was issued last February in 2017. Now, here's what it was going to be, I thought, which would be that the two questions would become one, and that the Latinx category would become a racial category, all right? And that's reflected here. So it's combined here. But there's a couple of other things going on with this as well. So there's it had not only check boxes, but now open-ended categories or open-ended response boxes for all the racial groups, not just some of them. So in other words, for the first time, blacks could say, talk about their specific, maybe national origin or ethnicity. Could say, you know, I'm Eritrean or I'm Somali, which they couldn't do before. And it allows whites to do that as well, all right? So open-ended boxes. And then it has some major choices here too, which is always problematic in deciding what are going to be the choices, you know, Jamaican, what are you going to pick? The other aspect, which has been lobbied for since 1990 census, is the addition now of a Middle Eastern or North African category because up until this time, these groups were counted as white. All right, is that clear? Now, you know what's happened since this time, of course, is a real regime change with respect to politics. And the big question, of course, which many of you are familiar with, that has emerged in the debates, is the citizenship question, which is posed to be asked on the 2020 census, which will, in fact, tremendously inhibit responses from a lot of immigrant communities, as well as undocumented folks, and leading to these lawsuits on the part of certain states, like California, that would lose millions and millions of dollars because of the undercount of those populations as a result of this. Well, not only that, but the Commerce Department, which oversees the census, in league with the Office of Management and Budget, has scaled back and pulled much of this debate about these categories. And this looks like what we're going to get for 2020, which is a return to two questions, the ethnicity one and the race question. You're going to have open-ended boxes, but we're going to take out the Middle Eastern category as well. So that's going to be dropped, and it looks like we're returning back to the twofold question format. Okay. Any questions about that? Yes.
Question. On the previous slide where it said that, so for whites, isn't it a little, when for example, when I meet a white person, they go back to their heritage.
Yes.
Whether they're from German or whatever it is.
Yes.
Do you think that would be a confusion point for them to say like, oh, it's my background, as opposed to just having ancestors and like?
Yes, it will be for many who find themselves of varying, I'm Scotch, Irish, I'm Norwegian, I'm this, yeah. It's not that they have to fill that part out. Do you see? They could just check white.
Right, but then there's an option for like, so could it not be that there's a white American or I don't know, I'm just like trying to wrap my head around whether that's fair saying that they're from German or Italian, taking that ethnicity away from like actual Germans who are here or like.
Yeah, but that's a dilemma that can't be solved on that basis. Yeah, Stephen?
This is really interesting, but this optimum elements question,
Yeah.
it doesn't conflate race and ethnicity?
Yes. Yes.
So if someone puts, Hispanic down, then how would the government determine whether that's an ethnic or a racial category? And originally, I thought that the shift was going to be that Latino and Latinx was going to become race as opposed to ethnicity.
It's trying to have your cake and eat it too, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we do have, we can, in compiling the data, you could figure out how large the Latinx population is, but you could also break it down by ethnicities, subgroup ethnicities. But we've been doing that with other groups too, like Asian Americans, for example, breaking out Chinese versus Korean versus Vietnamese kind of thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but in other words, that it is a curious thing. So in other words, it's the conflation in some ways of that, whereas before it was two distinct questions, but the big dividing line was whether you were Hispanic or not, right? Leading to those curious designations of the number of non-Hispanic whites who support something or other. But we're going to have that problem again, because they're probably not going to push those two things together. You had a question? I'm sorry.
I was going to ask if it was simply a staffing change in terms of the regime change that led to this, or was there other levels of decision making that made?
There's other levels of decision making. I'm pretty sure the Census Bureau never said we should put a citizenship question. That had to come from above, and I'm sure after all this research, they were looking at a format like this with a Middle Eastern category. Many of them want that Middle Eastern, North African category to this. So I'm thinking that much of this descends down from the Commerce Department through the particularly the White House Office of Management and Budget, which has significant control over the content of the census, among other things. So it's a White House thing, you know.
I guess seeing the different iterations of these categories now makes me more confused about, I guess, the difference between race and ethnicity. And I don't know, could you like just elaborate like a little more on what are like the commonly, like what's the common definition of?
You know, the problem is there is none in certain ways, okay? In other words, both of them are really social categories, really. You know, ethnicity often refers to one's quote-unquote ancestral national origins or something, but that could be, you know, a source of confusion as well. And also what it doesn't take into account, obviously, is the way individuals and groups self-identify as well. You know, like I understand there's like, and I may be wrong about this, something like 6 or 7 really different Burmese subgroups in the United States. And even to call them Burmese is to ignore what they believe to be significant modes of group and ethnic identification. Do you see what I mean? So there's always going to be a slipperiness to this stuff. And there's not going to be sort of a hard and fast way to make those distinctions. Although, you know, the federal government has, in terms of that Office of Management and Budget, Statistical Directive 15, defined what major racial groups are, what a major ethnic group is. But within those parameters, the kind of questions you're asking about how can we make a hard and fast decision around this is a pretty slippery one.
I think when I see that, I kind of think, is the hidden question, or it might not even be hidden, are they just trying to get at what color is your skin? You know, is that the race question? Like, literally, what color is your skin? And then ethnicity is, I don't know.
Yeah, you know, if the census were attuned to something, they might ask you 2 different questions. They might ask you, how do you self-identify? And how do other people identify you? And there would be probably, in a lot of instances, a lot of disparity between those 2 kinds of responses. And in many respects, for tracking or looking at, you know, substantive patterns of discrimination, it might be more interesting to see how you think other people see you, as opposed to how you want to self-identify as yourself. You know? And much of this is reflected, as I said, the original ones, the 2017 tests last year, were based on these kinds of focus group interviews in which people conducted about, you know, who should be, you know, considered Middle Eastern or North African, how we separate out that from white. Why don't we want more information on the immigration flows, the increasing heterogeneity of who blacks are in the United States? And we see these in places, you know, there's going to be these differences. Yeah, Stephen.
I want to ask you an ideological question. So, obviously, there is a lot of agitation and
Grab some water.
from the right wing
Uh-huh.
around the census, around politics, around not just congressional apportionment, but as you said, the flow of funding and how, you know, what does it mean in terms of demography. But there's a parallel kind of ideological movement and energy around the census coming more from the left wing that often critiques it as sort of reifying social constructs that need to be exploded to some extent.
Yeah.
And we saw a lot of this debate around gender recently in particular, around kind of, some say we just need to open it up entirely and have, you know, 50 unlimited categories, you know, and so I'm wondering how do you avoid getting caught in that debate in a way that ultimately leads to a complete rollback of the data collection that we actually need to understand inequality. And also avoids like opening it up so that people can do things like Jedi or Smurf.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
which they did.
Yeah, nonsensical.
I don't know, to be honest. And I think that many of these decisions are in fact policy calls, you know? In other words, what are you looking for? What are you trying to track? And and even the claims come in particular political contexts. When I first heard of the kind of, there's a number of significant Arab American civil rights groups. I heard this in Washington before the 1990 census, that were lobbying for a Middle Eastern category. And that was in the wake of the first Gulf War, as well as increasing kind of hate crimes being directed towards Arab Americans. Well, it's not a hate crime if a white person's hitting another white person, right? By the census definition. So what is the thing? Well, you have to say, well, hold it. We have to make some new categories here in response to this kind of political climate. But then the climate changes. In the wake of 9/11, many of those same groups didn't want a separate Middle Eastern category on the census for fears that they were going to be profiled, that data could be used in ways to surveil that community in many respects. So I guess, the answer is that there's never going to be kind of a hard and fast thing to this thing, that they result from certain kinds of their policy calls and decisions. And that there's times where you're going to lobby for certain kinds of categories. There's other times where you're going to argue for disaggregated data, like Asians have been doing for this, at UCLA, that Count Me In campaign, which was saying that lumping everybody as Asian disguises some really severe differences in the achievement gap or academic performance between Southeast Asians, like Hmong, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Koreans and Chinese. Japanese, these are all the kinds of, and let me say that even that can be rearticulated to serve other purposes, Like Anthony Scalia in the Fisher case said, how can we talk about Asian Americans? There's really Cambodians and there's this, but he's using it as a way to say, be dismissive of all racial categorization, right? So you got to be careful what you want to put out there, because it can always be flipped. And serve a very different kind of political purpose than you have in mind.
Just to follow up on that, when you proposed your two-part question, I was thinking about what Rachel Dolezal would say, right? So the first question being, how do you identify, and how other people identify? You're asking someone to think about their own lens of how other people, and kind of intersubjective. It's a tricky question. Ted Cruz has said that he wants the census to be on one postcard,
right.
One question. And imagine what that erases, like the kind of Brazilian or France situation where you have it essentially becomes a form of color.
Well, that's what's an interesting example. I'll talk about colorblindness in just a second, and and about the ways in which the pervasiveness of that ideology on efforts to get rid of racial and ethnic data. And basically, France is an excellent example of that, in that they don't track by race. I think actually the UK is one of the few European countries, Western European countries, that actually has race stuff on the census. But the French example should be evoked, and here I'm getting ahead of myself in the argument around colorblindness. They say, like, well, as if we got rid of the data, we wouldn't have any race problems. And France has got a whole bunch of race problems. It's just like it renders any sort of understanding or data around that, not clear. I mean, these are difficult questions. A lot of global censuses are moving away from the simple binary male-female option to check yourself off, to be third sex, or to embrace other forms of gender identification. I think that's another frontier too. That's it's about how those categories will evolve. Let me, for the sake of time, let me see here what we got. Okay, I want to get to that colorblindness stuff, but I want to go over something, and I could go over this pretty rapidly, because what I want to suggest to you about racial classification is that it's not only occurring through these state-based debates about the categories, but just to alert you to, without going into very deeply, that there's a lot of resurgent debates about what race may or may not mean as a marker of human variation. And this is particularly true in the race and the genomic sciences. And I just want to start out with a couple of quotes here that I like. This was at the completion of the mapping of the human genome, where Bill Clinton and significant genetic scientists, as well as Tony Blair from Britain was there. Anyway, this was really a big push about this thing about race during the successful mapping of the human genome. And here we have Bill Clinton's quote, "I believe that one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same." And at the same presentation, noted scientist, entrepreneur Craig Venter said, "What we've shown is that the concept of race has no scientific basis." Now, what's going to be interesting is that within 5 years of these remarks, many of the leading genomic scientists sort of were reversing course and embarking upon a new search for perhaps the biological meaning of race. And in many respects, what I want to alert you to is that we may be witnessing, there's kind of ominous signs that we may be witnessing a perhaps reinscription of race as biology. And this takes place, and I won't go through this very much. Many of this you know. Some has happened in the field of pharmacogenomics. Pharmacogenomics is trying to more precisely create custom-tailored drugs to suit certain individuals. And it's based on one's susceptibility to certain kinds of drug treatments and interventions. What's interesting about this drug, Bidil, was it was being touted by the pharmaceutical firm Nitromed as the first ethnic designer drug. And it says ethnic, but here they're talking about race. So here the race ethnicity stuff gets conflated again. I always show this slide and think about that. This guy looks like Bill Cosby, but I don't know if it really is him or not. Anyway, Bidil was the result of two really generic drugs to treat cardiovascular disease, hypertension, within the population as a whole. So anyway, what happens is that Nitromed goes to the Food and Drug Administration, this is the short wrap, and says it's got this drug. And the FDA says, well, it's kind of a combination of two generic drugs that have been on the market. We don't think there's any reason to give you a patent for this drug. There's nothing unique about it. Nitromed goes back to the data, kind of massages the data, and decides that Bidil seemed to work better among blacks in their sample than whites. And the statistics behind this is itself. There's an interesting book by a legal scholar named Jonathan Kahn, who talks all about this Bidil drug. And it became marketed for blacks resulting from hypertension. There's a slipperiness to this thing, which I could discuss later on too. It looks like it was marketed around congestive heart failure, and it looks like, at least this is how it was explained to me by a Stanford MD PhD, that it works good among people who suffer from diabetically induced cardiovascular disease, and not good among people where it doesn't work, don't have that. There's some other underlying condition, including heart defects, which are causing that. But it got read racially in certain ways, and it results also from the fact that blacks suffer to a higher degree than whites from diabetes in the United States. Also important to realize the sort of social context in which that occurs as opposed to a biological racial one. Let me get behind that. The other way this has been manifested is the absolute explosion in ethnic ancestry testing from groups like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, in which here we have Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates Jr., really doing these kind of, exploring your roots through in part through forms of genetic testing. If you ever want to, I've been working with a student in African American Studies who has been looking at YouTube videos of people after they discover or read the results of their ethnic ancestry testing. And it's really hilarious, you know, because people say, oh my gosh, you know, I am part Mexican. Maybe that explains something, you know, like something about them, and, oh, that, you know, they're using it as a kind of revelation to rethink their own racial identities based on this kind of testing. And the testing is really fraught with a lot of problems about sampling, about the fact that national boundaries change a lot. So if you're going to say you're found out you're like 15% Somali, let's go, you got to figure out who's 100% Somali and how has that been determined. So there's all this kinds of slippages with respect to doing ethnic ancestry testing as well. But where much of this research takes a much more ominous turn a bit is in criminal forensics and DNA profiling. And for those of you who've been enamored by a lot of CSI spin-offs, we have the promise of being able to determine the physical characteristics of crime suspects from the DNA they have left behind. Many of you may be familiar with the Joseph D'Angelo case. He's the one who's touted as the Golden State serial killer suspect, who was recently in for just a huge backlog of murders and rapes. I don't know if people are familiar with how they caught Joseph D'Angelo, former police officer, was through these ethnic ancestry databases by finding distant relatives and then narrowing the scope of who could that be. And in fact, what is a little disturbing is the ways in which criminal databases are being assembled for people who are picked up or arrested for felony convictions. What many people don't know, however, is that in order to get your DNA stuff taken out, say you're not guilty and the court finds you not guilty, you have to make a special case to get removed. In other words, not automatically get dropped. You're in there. And we find a lot of crimes by looking at, oh, there's some DNA evidence, and who do we have? Hey, we have this person, and it could be that that's their brother who committed the crime, by looking at whatever's in the DNA database to begin with. But even far more ominous may be the rise or the emergence of something called DNA forensic DNA phenotyping, which includes the ability, they say, to predict skin color. And I'm going to show you something here which is really scary in this regard. So this was in January 2015. The police in Columbia, South Carolina, released a sketch of a possible suspect in a double murder case, a cold case, that was generated by a computer relying solely on DNA found at the scene of the crime. So it said, what kind of skin tone this person possibly had and different kinds of markers. It's kind of scary because, this could look like a lot of people, and to put that out there as the kind of the racial profile on that was, of course, pretty disturbing. All right, let me try to just make an intervention here. To the degree that if you critique these categories, if you critique the race stuff, it could lead you into subscribing to an ideology of color blindness, where people believe that the most effective anti-racist ideology, gesture, or practice is simply to ignore race. And we've seen this. I mean, I have students in my classes that say, I don't see race. When I see somebody, I don't care if they're white, black. They usually say purple, green, few exotic colors to say this, that. I just don't see race. And it's as if, we don't, every one of us utilizes clues about race as a way of navigating through our daily lives, who we meet on the street, who our teacher is going to be, who the clerk at the supermarket is. All these things, I would argue, we rely on certain ways in which we racially categorize people, and we have certain kinds of meanings we attach to those identifications. That's the way we get around. And you know this by the fact that if there's a person you can't conveniently racial classify, it's sort of a crisis of racial meaning. You kind of got to know who they are. And people who are of ambiguous racial categories or people who are of mixed race always get asked, like, I was wondering, what are you? You know? Huh? Where are you really from? Yeah, where are you really from? You know, and like to trout their exotic categories like Eskimo or whatever, you know. It's interesting because I had a Latina, a student who in fact, you know, she could be read differently. You know, you could see her as quote unquote Arab, or you could see her as this, or you could say, and she says she gets asked that all the time, you know. People always, even though she herself is in fact, both her parents were Mexican American. Okay, this ideology of colorblindness, and why I raise it up is because if you believe these categories are imprecise, unstable, one solution you might think about is let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of the categories themselves. And you know, I caught myself on this years ago. I was doing some critiques about the census, and someone from the audience said, "You're right. That just backs up my point that we got to get rid of the racial and ethnic categories on the census," without thinking about what are we using that data for. And in fact, one of the persons who has pushed this, and I'll show him in a second, Ward Connerly. I want to use this as an illustration that over the past several decades, and emerging again, has been this concerted attempt by political conservatives to ban the collection of racial demographic information. And government policies that use racial categories are being increasingly criticized, accused of promoting color consciousness instead of color blindness. And in 2003, we had a proposition in this state called the Racial Privacy Initiative, which would have added this article to the California Constitution. It went down to defeat, and it went down to defeat in a curious way, but we could explore that later. That the state shall not classify any individual by race, ethnicity, color, or national origin in the operation of public education, public contracting, or public employment. And this was the brainchild of Ward Connerly, who many of you may know as the former University of California regent, who was the architect of California's Proposition 209, which bans affirmative action in, among other things, in admissions and contracting and a whole host of in other social domains as well. And if you just superficially read what Ward Connerly was saying, you might find yourself in agreement with it. You know, he says, dare we forget, this is the argument in the voter pamphlet, which he wrote, by the way. Dare we forget the lessons of history? Classification systems were intended to keep certain groups in their place and to deny them full rights. In fact, I wish I had the full thing here and the text of some of his talk, because he talks about, like, you know, the ways in which blacks have been disenfranchised, the ways in which all these kinds of ways in which oppressive laws and practices have been visited on groups of color. I mean, you read it and you think, God, the guy must take an ethnic studies or something, and he just got to sweep with it without thinking about what he's advocating here. Not only that, he also wanted to separate this out from the racist biology question. He says, preserving these kinds of categories preserves the myth, the dangerous view, that race is fixed biological reality. Okay? So, you know, in the kinds of arguments, it's very seductive if you're not clear about what he's in fact advocating for. Let me say in a nutshell what I think is the problem, is that Ward Connerly doesn't sufficiently, in many ways, distinguish the use of racial categories in our historic past from the way it's been used in a post-civil rights period. So beforehand, it's true. Prior to the passage of civil rights legislation in the 60s, census categories were utilized as to politically disenfranchise and discriminate against certain groups defined as non-white. See this, the 1924 National Origins Immigration Act, or prohibitions on naturalization rights, anti-miscegenation laws I talked about earlier. In many ways, these kinds of racial and ethnic categories were defined and strategically utilized to circumscribe the political, economic, and social rights of specific racialized groups. The thing is, however, after the passage of civil rights laws, census data was used to discern the patterns of discrimination practiced by businesses, schools, political institutions against people of color and other disadvantaged minorities. And data by race has become absolutely critical to the enforcement of every civil rights law passed since the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So thus, what Connolly doesn't realize is that the civil rights era marked an important shift in the way in which racial and ethnic data was used, from a tool to exclude specific groups to one used to ensure the inclusion and adequate representation of groups. So the other part of this I want to sort of conclude on is that in the Trump era, there's a kind of renewed concerted push really to suppress data on racial disparities. And examples have been introduced. This one was last year, which I thought was particularly pernicious, and I think I mentioned this to Al Sadiq too, is the prohibition of use of funds for to design, build, maintain, utilize, or provide access to federal database of geospatial information on community racial disparities or disparities in access to affordable housing. This is part of a, it was Senate Bill 103, which was called the Local Zoning Decisions Protection Act of 2017. That was introduced by Senators Mike Lee and Marco Rubio. And it's about federal housing. And here it inserted into this federal housing bill that you couldn't use federal funds to provide things on community racial disparities or access to affordable housing. And I utilize this as an example of the kind of groundswell or the emergence of pieces of legislation like this that add little things to them in order to strip out any sort of racial data collection mandates to them. And I'm going to end on a quote. I really like this quote. During the Proposition 54, the Racial Privacy Initiative I just cited, Ken Pruitt, who was the former director of the Census Bureau, who now teaches at Columbia, he sent me a short piece he wrote on the Racial Privacy Initiative. And I liked what he said. He said, "I'm happy to join Ward Connolly in welcoming a colorblind society, but I don't want to be blindfolded as it arrives." I think that's really appropriate. Yeah, we wish for a colorblind society, but we certainly don't want to be constrained and strapped to understand the depth and persistence of racial disparities in our midst. Right? So let me stop there, and then let's have some discussion. All right, thanks. Not all at once. Yeah, no. Yes.
As you mentioned, in the post-civil rights era, a lot of the times race and ethnicity are used in a benign fashion instead of detrimental
Exactly. Yeah.
fashion.
Right.
But sometimes even in the legal context, even a civil rights statute could be used differently. Depending on the context, like Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act are, I think, most recently used in a way that damaged racial minority groups.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, so how do you reconcile the two? From a political angle, or from a legal angle, how could you tell one from another? And I think that's the reason why the Supreme Court has been reluctant to to use race as a deciding factor in a lot of cases because it's difficult to do it retroactively and or I think it's easier, but either way,
Yeah.
it's
You,
difficult.
you can't reconcile it in certain ways. I wish Stephen was still here because he wrote an article, a law review article about racial classification through different juridical decisions and why the court, the Supreme Court, has never had a clear, made it clear what they consider to be even a racial classification as such. And and it's not that, it's sort of, and you know, anything by race is subject to the highest level of legal scrutiny, of strict scrutiny in examining it for the intent of certain kinds of policies and stuff. And there's wildly contradictory notions about that. So I can't reconcile it, and I think that it's just the ways in which the politics of race has always sort of befuddled the courts in many respects, you know? And in fact, I mean, think about, you know, key pieces of legislation. You know, even the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made on the narrowest of grounds, you know? It was about separate and equal with respect to educational institutions. It was not about separate but equal with respect to rights, transportation rights, accommodation rights, you know, anything else. And the court has always, in many respects, been rather reluctant to expand the scope of some of those cases. I'll give you another example, like the Colorado Baker case that just came down, right? It was based on this narrow thing of a commissioner on the Colorado State Commission made disparaging remarks about the Baker owners' religious ideology, right? Religious tradition. It was not to say that in every instance, a private business can, in fact, discriminate against a gay couple. Again, it just kicks the can down the road further to make a determination of how those things are going to be seen. So there is no clear, you know, reconciliation. But ask Stephen Menendian for that article, because I think it does a really good treatment of how the courts have had to grapple with what a racial classification is and its legal political significance.
Sorry, a follow-up question. Do you think race should have a social function in the society?
Should it have a...
Should it have a social function?
It,
in the society?
it's not that should it or not should it, it has. You know, in other words, it is there. It's not, it's you know, the other part of this is that even if you say race has no, say, biological or genetic basis, or it's not an appropriate marker of human variation, doesn't mean that social constructs of race disappear, and that the social constructs of race are all around us. They've been embedded in laws and practices, I mean, in stuff like Jim Crow, for example, but they operate at the most mundane level in our lives. And in the United States in particular, race has always taken on an inordinate amount of significance. And think about, too, the ways in which race is never static. Think about new racial categories, like the ways in which Muslim, Arab, South Asians have been seen as a kind of racialized group of ways in which we've treated. Think about how Spanish, really, in many respects, is kind of seen in a kind of a racialized context as well, you know? So I guess what I'm suggesting here, it's not a matter of me saying, yeah, I don't think race should operate as a social construct or not. It's that it does. And the question is, how does it do that? And what are the kinds of ways in which that is manifested, not only in terms of of institutions and the distribution of political power, but how that affects us on a daily basis, how that affects us in our relationships with other people. I think that's what's important. Yes?
So, I have two questions. One, in the article, the chapter 4 that got sent out, something that was mentioned was how, like, society at large is patterned on race, but and then in your commentary to that quote, you mentioned that you find resistance to also be patterned on race. And I just, like, because the example that you mentioned in here was like how different, like, you know, gender groups, whatever, different groups who are trying to organize their resistance, like, borrow a lot or rely a lot on Black liberation movement. And I was trying to understand, like, because when you first said resistance is patterned on race, I imagined, like, oh, like, we all resist within, like, we're like, oh, like, I'm going to do rights for this specific census group, right? So I'm just, like, but then when you gave that example, I was like, oh, okay, clearly I misunderstood what you meant by resistance patterned on race, so I wanted to ask you for...
Well, I meant that sort of concepts of race are imposed from above, and they're contested or argued from below, let's say. It's a good example of this. Think about, like, until the early 1970s, there was no Asian Americans. You know, there were separate ethnic groups. There were Chinese, Japanese, oftentimes in antagonistic relationship with each other, given historically the wars in the Pacific and others. And what it was a way of thinking about the commonalities of experiences, the kinds of discriminatory treatment, patterns of marginalization or ghettoization that different Asian ethnic groups, at that time, mainly Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, to a much lesser extent Korean, the Korean population was extremely small, to develop a much more racialized identity as being Asian Americans, and to lobby for certain, for recognition or for certain kinds of practices. That's something that comes from below too. But it also results from above, because during, for example, some of the most prominent Asian American campaigns were about anti-Asian violence, where an individual was, you know, harassed, assaulted, or in many cases, like Vincent Chin in Detroit, murdered on the basis of a misidentification. An auto worker foreman and his stepson thought Vincent Chin was Japanese, and it was during a troubling time in the American auto industry, which was losing ground with respect to Japanese imports. So here you have somebody who gets killed. There's others, Jim Liu, who was Chinese, who thought it was Vietnamese, and he gets that mistaken identity, all Asians look alike, solidifies in certain ways a kind of political response too, realizing that you know, you can't escape the kind of broader patterns of racialization that you need to sort of band in solidarity with other groups. You know, I think one of the first victims post 9/11, I believe, was South Asian, an Asian, right, in the Southwest somewhere. You know, Sikh guy, not even Muslim, not Arab, not anything, but is misidentified. That's the kind of way in which that's a kind of pervasive kind of racialization, which could lead to groups seeking forms of solidarity and resistance from below in doing that. You have to redefine those categories in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Can I ask a second?
Sure.
So this is something that came up for me. You know that book, The Color of Law?
Yeah.
About like zoning in the north, so to speak.
Yeah.
The Bay Area a lot. In reading your piece as well, like you speak about this shift, right, where we go from like using race as a category to a class, and now it's like a data collection method to fund maybe hopefully reparations.
Yeah.
If we want to be, you know, really generous about it. So the thing that I'm like, that book made me think a lot about how, like, okay, like in the north, so to speak, it's not so much like de facto or de jure. It's more like we speak about it as de facto, but in fact, like it's clear that from like all of these like not explicit but clearly racialized laws and zoning laws, like there was very explicit racism.
Sure.
In place.
Sure.
And like, I wanted to ask you the question of like, so you brought up an example from Louisiana, Alabama. Like, what do you think made it so that there's like this like difference in how like it's clearly not it's not a difference in how racism is practiced, so to speak, specifically when it comes to like laws that are racially targeting to oppress racial groups. But it's like how we see them. So like my question is like, why do we see ourselves in like California or like, you know, the north, not the south, we're not Louisiana, so we think of ourselves as like more colorblind when in fact we're not.
Right.
And like I'm just really do you have any thoughts on like why, like where that transition happened, or like why is there that divide?
Well, one thing is that California is one of the most diverse states, right? And it's been, at least historically, been a magnet for a lot of different immigrant groups as well. But I mean, I think it's a false dichotomy, you know.
You don't know why?
No, I mean, let's say, you know, in the South, during the struggles in the 50s and 60s against, you know, like desegregating lunch counters, one of the, in the South, there's Woolworths, which was a general kind of, I don't know how to describe Woolworths, sort of like a precursor to like a Target store, had everything in it. They wouldn't allow blacks to sit at the lunch counters. They could take food out, but not. In San Francisco here, Woolworth, where, I mean, I grew up in San Francisco. Woolworth was right on, if you're familiar with downtown, it's right at the Powell Street cable car turnoff. It was where the Gap is now. And Woolworth didn't have that same policy here. Although people mobilized and protested Woolworths as part of a national chain. So in other words, the practices that were going on in the South differed from what was going on here. But nonetheless, the corporate thing was really overlooking the kinds of ways in which they were being racially discriminatory. But California has its own thing. I mean, San Francisco has its own thing around, you know, from housing laws, restrictive covenants. Well, Richard Rothstein's thing too around the East Bay Richard. But you know, I think it's a little bit of a mistake to think that things were so different, though. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's kind of saying, oh, we were never bad as Mississippi or Alabama. It's true, too, in some ways. But it kind of ignores the ways in which, in legal and political practice, many of those same things were operative here, and really deeply shaped where people live, and the interactions between different groups too. And so I guess my answer to that in a roundabout way is to say, yeah, there's differences, and there's local and regional differences. That's always going to be expressed in some ways. But it was never a thing like all the nasty stuff was in the South and the West Coast escaped that kind of virulent racism. You know, in fact, California, the ways in which anti-black racism got expressed in the 19th century, people feared blacks coming into the state, and later feared Chinese because they thought Chinese were going to give us the same kind of race problem that they had in the South. I mean, the explicit thing around Chinese exclusion was the fears of creating another race problem that would parallel what happened in the South. And this is right in the immediate wake of the Civil War. So, yeah, we had our own issues. Yeah.
Do you think, so earlier in one slide you mentioned that Hindu was considered a ethnic or a race.
Yeah.
Do you think today it would be Muslim/Islam?
We're not supposed to, you know, what's interesting about census is you can't ask questions about religion, and there's supposed to be no religious designation. So that Hindu thing was really a kind of racialized category. Yeah, would we have another category like that? Probably not. That's the Middle Eastern, North African turn towards that.
What about in the political rhetoric that's been going on that's conflating Islam and Muslim as more an ethnic group than a religion, where...
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true in the political discourse. And I think there's a conflation of that with Arab, people from the Middle East, not thinking about where. What, isn't Indonesia the home to the largest number of Muslims in the globe? You don't think about people from Indonesia in those same ways. It's just kind of reflective of a kind of a shorthand, really, isn't it? To make those kinds of leaps and claims. I don't think it's going to appear on the census like that. No, this is going to be regional. If you looked at the definitions, they always refer to a sense of original peoples inhabiting a specific territory, and even that, if you think about it, is wrong. You can never make those kind of claims. All the definitions here are persons having origins in any of the original peoples. Who are the original peoples? That's subject to a lot of anthropological debate. So no, I don't think we're going to go in that direction. Now, the rhetoric in politics, that's totally different. What we're
Can
going
you
to say.
share the story about the Native American, or sorry, the Native Hawaiians?
Yeah, what happened was in the lead up to Census 2000, many Native Hawaiians were complaining about the difficulty that many of the students from Hawaii, Pacific Islander students, encountered in getting into mainland college institutions, among other things, because they were lumped together with Asian Americans. So, there was, then if you argue for forms of underrepresentation or affirmative action, they were dismissed because, hey, but we got tons of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on this campus. And in fact, that later led to key senators, including Daniel Inouye and Senator Akaka, who really posed this thing. He wanted to move Asians from, and it said Asian and other Pacific Islanders move Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders into the American Indian and Alaska Native category. So that was the demand that was being made of this. So this goes before the Office of Management and Budget, and it was the Clinton White House at the time. And you're going to get several stories of this, but I'm going to tell you what I thought happened, all right? Based on something I did with another colleague of mine. It seemed kind of apparent that a lot of Native American groups did not want to see that move because it would change the kind of profile of who the Native American, Alaska Native population was, but plus that Native Hawaiians don't have sovereignty. They're lobbying for it. They've been fighting for this for decades. But that major sort of tribes nations have sovereignty. They have unique state-to-state relations with the United States. Native Hawaiians don't. And that would politically muddy the group. I say this is what I think because some groups say, oh, no, we never said that. Or we never. I think they did push on this. And so what happens is the whole Hawaiian delegation, legislative delegation, gets invited, and the Office of Management and Budget tells them, here's what we're going to do. We're going to split the category, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and give you your own category. Nobody argued for their own category. And so it was like this kind of Solomon-like decision of just cutting up the category. And so for the first time since the 1970s, we had a brand new group, freestanding group. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. It's like a tenth or 100th of 1% of the American population. We can't even put a Middle Eastern right on there, but we got that. And it was totally politics. And part of it was, I was told that the Clintons' White House was worried that Native Americans had just faced a bad round of appropriations for the Department of Interior and for Native American interests. And so they didn't want to upset the Native Americans. At the same time, they wanted to give the Hawaii congressional legislation of senators, congresspeople, and the governor of Hawaii something. So this was their compromise. So now every state, every locale has to employ these minimal requirements. So in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we know how many Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders there are because you have to report that. So that makes sense. It's all political in many respects. The same thing happened with the multiracial category. Groups of people were lobbying for a separate multiracial category on the census. Major civil rights groups were opposed to that. And they were opposed to that for fearing a diminishment in numbers. So we had the National Council of La Raza umbrella organization of some 150 organizations. Not supporting that. Many black organizations didn't. And so what you got instead was something nobody wanted, which is multiple checkoffs. You could check off of all that apply. And that's what we have now, right? You could check off as many as you want, 2 or more racial groups. That was in 2010 too. What does it say here? Let's see. It doesn't say, please answer. Oh, it doesn't give you that instruction. But the instruction is that you can mark off all that apply. Yeah.
When they do decide to have the more expanded categories,
Yeah.
does like the federal government then like synthesize it back to the main, the
Yes.
top 4?
Yes.
And, you know, so
Yes.
is it kind of just like keeping the peace by allowing people to identify how they choose to identify, and then in the end, it's, you know, people are going to get lumped together anyways?
They are, but that data will be preserved. So there's this place in, I think it's in Indiana, that the census relies on. You say you're something, there is a huge code book that is absolutely amazing. I think it's got like 1,000 or more ethnic groups listed, you know? The groups you've never heard of. I remember one, Weezort. I can't remember what that was. Or these other ones that are a small community of black Native Americans, something historically somewhere in, you know, Georgia or something. They have this comprehensive numbers, and those are kept. So if you write that down, they will know that. The data will be there. But in terms of policies, or particularly at the federal level, it'll get coded back up. They're looking at the raw numbers on respect to that. Think about this, for example. Hawaii's always complained that until they started mapping even Native Hawaiians or even Asian ethnic groups, which they didn't before very well, that the whole census was totally useless for planning purposes in Hawaii, because it didn't talk about all the groups that were in Hawaii, you know, which they needed the kind of data on for public health, for things around education, et cetera. So,
Quick
yeah.
question. I'm just looking at this. It's going to make my life so difficult. So what if someone checked white, black, and, well, actually all of the boxes? How is
Yeah.
Census going to calculate or count that?
You get counted towards each one.
Oh, God.
So in other words, the numbers never add up to 100%. So you say, I'm black Korean. You will get counted as part of the Korean population in the United States and part of the black population in the United States. But they'll break it down too. They'll say number of people who checked off Korean only, number of people who checked off Korean and other, and you could see the data, like of the others, what others did they say? You know, you can break that data down. But in terms of the raw numbers, an individual can count towards several different groups and will be counted towards several different groups. That's why people didn't want the multiple checkoffs. If you're going to
I feel like we should have this information so that we know when we fill out the census what it's going to be
used for, yeah.
I want to know how my answers are going to be used in order to answer it in a way that I agree with.
Yeah, no, people don't know that. They don't tell you that in certain ways, you know. Yeah, LCD?
Question, right? Do we should be always advocating for keeping the census data based on race and ethnicity? In my line of work, I think that is extremely valuable for us to do so. And regardless of what the changes might happen, one is if you work through any type of research, you want to advance the claims of minority groups or racial groups or marginalized groups. If you don't have the data, it will be extremely hard for you even to make that claim. You could make, you know, oratorial claim like, okay.
Yeah.
For example, when I look at the number of black farmers that are losing their land toward white farmers in the last 100 years, I could really figure that out.
Yeah.
From the sense of that.
Yeah.
But without this kind of data, I cannot even make claim that the federal government should invest more in the younger black farmers' access to credit.
Yes.
So I know a lot of minority groups like screaming here and there, but but I think it's really, and I agree with you, you know, sometimes if we critique it too much, maybe we don't know what we're going to get.
Yeah, you don't know what you're going to get. You got to watch it. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think both those points are well. Punai's thing about, yeah, it's really true. We don't know too much about what the census stuff is used for. The census doesn't put out stuff about, here's what we use the census for, you know? It's made it seen at its most general mission and vision as a simple accounting one of giving a national portrait of who we are. But like congressional, the seats in the House of Representatives are contingent on, it's a fixed number. Once it's a zero-sum game. I mean, it didn't used to be, but now it is. One state's gain is another state's loss, you know, or federal dollars for different groups, you know. An undercount for states like California or New York or Texas has a devastating impact on their numbers on that, stuff like that. So, you know, on the one hand, you could do this exercise and critique the categories, say, wow, what does that mean? Or, you know, but on the other hand, you got to push for the data too. In other words, you know, there's things we want to know. We want to trace those persistent patterns, you know, which they can't do in France. You know, how much is that, you know, what's the incarceration rate among Algerians or you know, their access to housing in the suburbs of Paris, you know? You just don't know that stuff because you don't have data.
Just recently came back from the UN convening a second regional conference on people of African descent. So I was talking to a black Danish. I asked him how many black Danish in Denmark. He said, I have no idea. I have no clue, and we cannot even define who we are. And he was just praising the U.S. black, even the newcomers from the U.S. black. They actually can know how many they are, and they can rely on this data. He said, in Denmark, I born in Denmark, I'm Danish. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Like I have just to make a decision. Like I look at you, whether you are or not. So sometimes we don't know, even with all the shortcomings, how valuable this data is for us.
Yeah.
Trends and
Yeah.
to anticipate public policy.
Yeah, no, that's right. We don't. All right. We good? Thanks, folks. Thanks for being attentive. Thank you.